Imagine trying to pay for your wedding by building a literal mountain of stone.
I mean, that sounds like an absolute nightmare.
Right. It's a stressful situation trying to impress any future father-in-law. But put yourself in the sandals of an ancient Egyptian scribe for a second.
Okay, I'm there.
Your future father-in-law is a pharaoh, and you're just sitting there complaining that your knees are absolutely killing you for maintaining that classic squatting pose all day.
Oh, yeah, you know the one. You always see it in the museum statues.
Exactly. And the dowry to marry this guy's daughter, it requires orchestrating the construction of a giant tomb and funding an engagement party that involves a procession of war chariots all the way from Abu Simbel.
Yeah, I mean, that makes booking a modern caterer look like a walk in the park.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are pulling from a massive stack of sources. We've got translated temple inscriptions, modern architectural analyses, and some newly unearthed archaeological logs that honestly completely upend what we thought we knew.
They really do change the whole perspective.
Yeah. And our mission today is to just skip the dry dates and dusty textbook definitions. We're going to uncover the strange, the funny, and the deeply human mechanisms of ancient Egypt.
Which is exactly what you want when you look at history.
Right. We're getting into the nuts and bolts of their obsessive building projects, how they basically invented state propaganda, and the bizarre, frankly, tragic mechanics of how their language completely vanished.
Well, to really understand how this civilization functioned, we have to look at how it started.
Okay, lay it on us.
If we go back to roughly 3150 BC, Egypt wasn't one country. It was two distinct regions. You had Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north.
Right.
And the entire machine starts with King Narmer, who finally unifies the north and the south.
Yeah.
There is a very famous artifact called the Narmer palette that documents this exact moment.
I've seen pictures of that. King Narmer is depicted wearing this massive hat, right?
Oh, yeah. A huge hat. He's drawn like 4 to 5 times larger than everyone else, and he's just casually smiting his enemies.
And beyond just being a pretty brutal piece of art, that unification fundamentally changes human history.
It absolutely does.
Because they establish Memphis as the new capital. And suddenly, you have a massive unified state spanning hundreds of miles of the Nile.
Yeah.
That requires the birth of a complex bureaucracy. I mean, you have to manage grain, collect taxes, organize labor.
Precisely. You have this booming bureaucratic machine, and what is the very first thing this newly organized state turns its vast resources toward?
I'm guessing it wasn't public parks.
No, it was the afterlife.
Yeah.
But early on, this obsession created an absolute logistical nightmare.
How so?
Well, because the early kings had just unified the two lands by force, they were politically terrified of looking like they favored one region over the other. So their solution was to build 2 tombs.
Wait, hold on. 2 tombs for one body.
Yeah, 2 entire tombs.
Practically speaking, how does that even work? Did they just leave one empty as a decoy?
That's exactly what they did. They built 1 tomb in Abydos, way down south. In Egyptian mythology, the god Osiris.
Lord of the underworld, right?
Right. Osiris was believed to be buried in Abydos. Building a tomb there allowed the king to tap into that divine power.
Okay, that makes sense for the religious side.
But then they'd build a second massive structure up north in Saqqara, near the capital, just to project political power. It was a massive drain on the new economy, just to say, hey, I'm the ruler of everywhere.
So they are essentially building summer and winter homes for eternity.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the architecture itself. I think we all have this image of the perfect smooth pyramids just popping up out of the sand, but the sources show us this was a brutal process of trial and error.
A very, very expensive trial and error. The evolution really starts with King Zoser and his architect, Imhotep.
Okay.
Before them, kings were buried under flat, rectangular wood brick structures called mastabas. Imhotep had the brilliant idea to build a mastaba out of stone and then stack smaller and smaller ones on top of it.
Which becomes the step pyramid at Saqqara.
Yep. It basically looks like a giant, blocky staircase to the sky.
But a staircase wasn't enough for later pharaohs, was it? They wanted that sleek, iconic geometric shape.
Right. They wanted the true pyramid.
And this leads to the saga of King Sneferu. I was reading the architectural breakdown of his reign, and it is honestly a disaster class in civil engineering.
It really is.
He tries to build the first true, smooth-sided pyramid at a place called Mitam, but they don't understand the physics of the casing stones, and the outer layer literally collapses into a pile of rubble.
Just a complete failure. So Sneferu abandons it. He moves over to Dashur and starts a second attempt.
Which we know today is the bent pyramid, right?
Exactly. The engineers started building at a very steep 54-degree angle. But as they got halfway up, the sheer weight of the stone began causing cracks in the internal chambers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the engineers did the math and realized the entire structure was going to implode. So, in a total panic, they abruptly shifted the angle down to 43 degrees. The finished product literally looks bent.
I just picture Sneferu standing in the desert, looking at this crooked mountain and demanding they start over again. Because, I mean, he actually commissions a third pyramid.
He does. He finally gets the geometry right on the third try with the red pyramid, achieving that perfect, smooth slope.
Talk about a stubborn real estate developer.
Yeah, it drained an unbelievable amount of national wealth, but it perfected the engineering blueprint, which was very fortunate for his son, Khufu.
Right, Khufu.
He took that blueprint and scaled it to a level that still baffles people today. Khufu built the Great Pyramid of Giza.
Let's ground the listener in the sheer scale of this for a second. It's 150 meters tall. It is made of 2.5 million blocks of stone, and each block weighs about 2 tons.
It's just staggering.
How in the world did they manage the labor for this?
Huh.
The Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt thousands of years later and claimed it took 90,000 enslaved people, right?
Yeah, well, Herodotus was a fantastic storyteller, but a terrible statistician. Modern archaeology has completely debunked that 90,000 number.
Oh, really?
Yeah. If you look at the excavation of the workers' villages near Giza, we see evidence of a highly organized, well-fed workforce of maybe 20 to 30,000 skilled laborers.
And they weren't enslaved.
No, not at all. It was a system of corvée labor. During the inundation season, when the Nile flooded and farmers couldn't work their fields, they paid their taxes to the state through labor.
Oh, I see.
The state, in turn, housed them and fed them premium rations. We're talking lots of beef, lots of beer. It was a national project that actually helped unify the population.
Well, while we are myth-busting, let's address the most famous rumor about the Giza Plateau. The Sphinx, which sits right next to the pyramids, is missing its nose.
Yes, the famous missing nose.
And I know I was taught in school that Napoleon Bonaparte used it for target practice and shot it off with a cannon.
It's an incredibly persistent myth, but it's completely false.
Really? So what happened?
We have sketches of the Sphinx from European travelers made in the 1700s, decades before Napoleon was even born, and the nose is already gone. It was likely destroyed by a religious zealot in the 14th century. When Napoleon actually arrived in Egypt in 1798, he didn't want to destroy the monuments.
Right.
He brought a massive team of 150 scholars and scientists with him to document everything. He actually loved the culture, and that expedition essentially launched the modern field of Egyptology.
Okay, so the Old Kingdom is clearly defined by projecting power through these massive physical mountains of stone. But eventually, the economy just can't sustain it.
No, it burns out.
The state fractures. And when we look at the later periods, we see a fascinating shift. Controlling the physical landscape becomes less important than controlling the narrative.
To see how that shift happens, we really have to look at the collapse of the Old Kingdom, which was largely triggered by a pharaoh named Pepi II.
Pepi II.
Yes, Pepi took the throne as a young child and ruled for 94 years.
I mean, imagine you were an Egyptian citizen at this time. Your grandfather, your father, and you've all lived your entire lives under the exact same ruler.
It's unprecedented.
As he aged into his 90s, the government must have completely fossilized.
It did. The centralized power structure broke down because the local governors gained way too much power while the pharaoh was physically weak.
Right.
And after Pepi II died, the texts describe a period of absolute societal meltdown. One source claims there were 70 kings in 70 days.
Which is obviously hyperbole, but it tells us the bureaucracy completely shattered. And this internal weakness allows a group of foreigners from West Asia, the Hyksos, to invade and take over northern Egypt.
Exactly.
But as I was reading the sources, something really stood out to me. We know almost nothing about the Hyksos from the Egyptians themselves. They barely mention them. Why would they ignore a massive foreign occupation?
This comes down to the Egyptian concept of writing itself. For the ancient Egyptians, hieroglyphs weren't just letters.
Right.
They called them medu-neter, which means the words of the gods. They believed that writing something down actually gave it physical reality in the universe.
Wait, like magic?
Pretty much. If you carved the story of a defeat into stone, you were making that defeat permanent, inviting chaos into the world, fearing the evil eye, essentially. So they simply didn't record failures.
That is wild. Ancient Egyptian history is basically a heavily curated Instagram feed.
That's a great way to put it.
They completely delete the Hyksos invasion from the timeline to protect their cosmic order. Just a bad hair day, completely scrubbed.
And this obsessive need to project constant victory completely dictated their foreign policy during the New Kingdom era. Take Thutmose III, for example.
Okay.
The Egyptians became heavily imperialistic and wanted to control the Levant, which is modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. It was crucial for trade routes. But Thutmose faced a massive cultural hurdle.
The hurdle being that Egyptians were absolutely terrified of leaving Egypt.
Exactly. The Egyptian religion was intimately tied to the soil of Egypt. If you died in foreign lands away from the Nile and the proper burial rites, your soul might be lost forever.
Oh, wow.
So Thutmose III would march his army north, conquer a city in the Levant, demand a tribute of gold and grain, and then immediately march his entire army back home to the safety of the Nile.
Which makes zero strategic sense. Because the minute the Egyptian army walks away, the conquered city realizes there's no occupying force.
Right.
They just stop paying the tribute.
Which forced Thutmose III to march out and invade the exact same territory 18 years in a row.
18 years.
Yeah. It was a grueling cycle driven entirely by the tension between their imperial ambitions and their religious fear of dying abroad.
But the absolute master of papering over strategic failures was Ramses II. He ruled for 67 years and fought a massive multi-year conflict against the Hittite Empire.
Which was a powerhouse situated in modern-day Turkey.
Right. The conflict culminated in the Battle of Kadesh. If you visit Egypt today, Ramses plastered the story of Kadesh on almost every major temple. The carvings show him single-handedly defeating the entire Hittite army.
He essentially invented the political spin room because modern historians can now read the Hittite records of that exact same battle, and the Hittite version tells a very different story.
I bet it does.
It was likely a bloody stalemate, and Ramses actually had to retreat. But he controlled the media at home, so he declared a total victory. He even built the colossal temple of Abu Simbel deep in the south to project this godlike dominance.
The engineering of Abu Simbel is staggering. I mean, he had it carved directly into a mountain, and it's aligned so perfectly that twice a year, the rays of the rising sun penetrate 200 feet deep into the sanctuary to illuminate the face of his statue.
It's incredible.
It was such a masterpiece that in the 1960s, when modern Egypt built the Aswan Dam and the Nile waters began to rise, the global community panicked.
Okay.
UNESCO literally had to saw the entire mountain into huge blocks, raised up a cliff face, and reassemble it like a puzzle just to save Ramses' ancient PR stunt.
It's a testament to how effectively he built his legacy. But, all of this monumental architecture, from the pyramids to Abu Simbel, created a systemic vulnerability for the state.
How so?
If you are a grave robber, a giant pyramid or a massive temple is basically a glowing billboard that says, hey, here lies the GDP of Egypt, buried in solid gold.
Right. It's just asking to be robbed.
Yeah.
Which forces another massive pivot in Egyptian history. The pharaohs realize they have to stop building mountains and start hiding.
Exactly.
This ushers in the era of the Valley of the Kings, where tombs are carved underground in remote desert canyons. And what's fascinating is that this shift away from giant public displays of power seems to open the door for some massive disruptions in who actually gets to hold power.
Oh, absolutely. The New Kingdom is full of rule breakers, particularly regarding gender and succession. To understand this, we have to look at the legal mechanics of the royal bloodline. In ancient Egypt, the divine right to rule was deeply tied to the royal women. Often, the only way a man could legitimize his claim to the throne was by legally marrying the great royal wife, the woman who carried the purest royal blood.
So the women essentially held the genetic keys to the kingdom.
Yes, they did.
Which perfectly explains how Queen Hatshepsut managed to pull off her reign. She didn't just act as a temporary regent for a young male heir. She stepped up and declared herself full pharaoh, king of Egypt.
In a time when that was globally unheard of.
Right. And she justified it by claiming the god Amun had literally disguised himself as her father to conceive her.
She completely weaponized theology to secure her throne. And under her rule, Egypt thrived. She expanded trade down the African coast. She built Dera el-Bahari.
That's the temple that looks completely modern, right? With the terrace.
Yes, incredibly elegant. And she erected massive 500-ton granite obelisks. But alongside this brilliant political maneuvering, there's some juicy historical gossip about her private life.
Oh, this involves her chief architect, a man named Senenmut. He was a commoner, not royal at all, but he held immense power in her court. Many historians look at the subtle clues and suspect they were lovers.
The architectural evidence is very compelling. Senenmut was allowed to build his own tomb very close to Hatshepsut's temple, and the tunnels were seemingly aligned so that they would connect or face each other in the afterlife.
Which was a massive breach of protocol.
Huge breach. And of course, later kings were so deeply threatened by the precedent of a highly successful female ruler that they sent masons out with chisels to physically scrape her name and image off the monuments.
Trying to use that magic of writing to delete her from existence, but they missed a few spots.
Luckily for us, yeah.
However, if we want to talk about the ultimate disruption, we have to talk about Akhenaten. He comes to power in a society completely dominated by the priests of the god Amun. These priests controlled vast estates, grain silos, and incredible wealth.
The priesthood had become almost a shadow government at this point. So Akhenaten initiates what is arguably the most radical political maneuver in the ancient world.
What does he do?
He forces the entire country to abandon thousands of years of polytheism. He decrees that there is only one god, the Aten, represented by the sun disk. And conveniently, Akhenaten declares that he is the sole intermediary for this god.
It's brilliant in its ruthlessness. With one decree, he makes the powerful Amun priests entirely obsolete and redirects all the nation's wealth back to himself.
Exactly.
He even abandons the ancient capital of Thebes, marches out into the barren desert, and builds a brand new city called Amarna from scratch.
He changed everything. He ordered the artists to change the way pharaohs were depicted. Instead of the idealized muscular statues, Akhenaten is shown with an elongated face, a pronounced belly, and wide hips.
That's a weird shift.
Very weird. He's also shown playing affectionately with his daughters, which was unprecedented in royal art. And he broke the deepest taboo of Egyptian religion regarding death.
Right. For millennia, Egyptians buried their dead on the west bank of the Nile, where the sun sets, symbolizing the journey into the underworld. Akhenaten builds his royal tomb on the east bank, where the sun rises.
He was systematically dismantling the entire psychological foundation of the culture, which is why, as soon as he dies, the establishment strikes back hard.
Very hard. Akhenaten is succeeded by a very young boy, originally named Tutankhamun, meaning the living image of the Aten. He takes the throne at about 8 or 9 years old.
Just a kid.
Yeah. I used to think King Tut just casually decided to go back to the old religion, like hitting undo on a computer. But reading the sources, you realize this was a brutal political counter-revolution. This 9-year-old kid is completely surrounded by the surviving priests of Amun and military generals.
He was essentially a political hostage. The old guard forces him to change his name to Tutankhamun, honoring the old god Amun.
Erasing his dad's legacy.
Yep. They abandon the desert city of Amarna, returned to Thebes, and issued decrees restoring all the wealth and land to the old priesthoods. Tutankhamun is paraded around as the face of this restoration, but he dies under murky circumstances around age 19.
So what does this all mean for King Tut? We treat him like the ultimate pharaoh today because his tomb was discovered completely intact in 1922, filled with solid gold masks and chariots.
Right.
But politically speaking, he was a minor, weak figurehead controlled by his advisors. He's only famous because robbers missed his tomb.
That's the irony. His fame is entirely an accident of archaeology. Grave robbers missed his tomb because it was buried under the debris of a later tomb. It gives us a breathtaking look at royal wealth. But the boy himself was just a pawn in a much larger struggle for the soul of Egypt.
And even though the old guard won that struggle, the empire eventually begins to crack under the weight of internal corruption and external pressures. The decline is slow, but the specifics of how the society breaks down are fascinating. For instance, look at the reign of Ramesses III.
Ramesses III faces a massive internal threat known as the harem conspiracy. Several of his secondary wives and court officials orchestrate a plot to assassinate him and place a rival prince on the throne. We actually have the papyrus transcripts of the trials for the conspirators.
And what blew my mind reading those transcripts is the punishment. Because the ancient Egyptians didn't have prisons.
No prisons existed.
If you think about it economically, in an agrarian society where surplus grain is your only real wealth, why would the state spend precious food and resources housing people who aren't working the fields?
Precisely. The justice system was entirely corporal and immediate. For the lesser conspirators in the harem plot, the judges ordered their noses and ears to be sliced off.
Oh my God.
Yeah, you carried your criminal record on your face for the rest of your life.
But chopping off ears doesn't solve the systemic issues. The central government eventually fractures again, and this time they don't recover. It becomes a revolving door of foreign conquerors.
A long, slow decline.
First, the Libyans cross the borders. Then the Nubians from the south take over.
And we should note that the Nubians heavily embraced Egyptian culture. They actually built their own beautiful, steep-angled, smaller pyramids down in what is now Sudan.
Right.
But after the Nubians, the invasions become relentless. The Assyrians arrive with superior iron weapons, then the Babylonians, then the Persians. Sovereignty just slips away.
There is one brief gasp of independence under Nekhnibo II, the last native Egyptian pharaoh. But he gets swept aside, and eventually Alexander the Great rolls in.
Changing everything again.
The Greeks take over for 300 years, which establishes the Ptolemaic dynasty. I think a lot of people don't realize that Cleopatra, the famous queen of Egypt, wasn't ethnically Egyptian. She was part of this Macedonian Greek ruling class.
Yes. And it is during this Greek occupation that we see the most tragic element of this deep dive, the total death of hieroglyphs.
This part is wild.
It wasn't caused by a massive fire burning down a library or a targeted cultural genocide. It was caused by the ancient equivalent of a spreadsheet.
Wow. Walk us through how the Greeks accidentally killed a 3,000-year-old language.
Well, you have to understand how temples functioned in ancient Egypt. They weren't just places of worship. They were the economic engines of the country.
Okay.
The temples owned vast tracts of farmland, they operated massive grain silos, and they ran the schools where the scribes learned to read and write the complex hieroglyphic script.
Right. The priests were basically the local administrators and record keepers.
But when the Ptolemaic Greeks arrived, they viewed Egypt as an agricultural factory. They wanted maximum grain extraction to fund their own wars and lavish lifestyle.
Sure, typical empire stuff.
They looked at these massive Egyptian temple complexes and saw massive inefficiency. Priests, in the eyes of the Greek administrators, did not generate enough agricultural profit.
So the Greek administration starts redirecting the wealth. They heavily tax the temple lands or just seize them outright.
Exactly. They systematically defund the temple economy. And when the temples lose their funding, they can't afford to keep the scribal schools open. The intricate knowledge of hieroglyphs was completely concentrated in that priestly class. So as the schools closed, the priests scattered or died out. The writing system wasn't banned. It was just starved of resources.
That is just devastating to think about.
Within a few generations, the ability to read the language simply evaporated.
So a 3,000-year-old language and culture wasn't destroyed by a massive fiery battle. It was destroyed by corporate budget cuts and middle management looking for better margins.
The physical monuments survived, the massive columns, the pyramids, but the voice of the people who built them went completely silent for nearly 2,000 years until the Rosetta Stone finally allowed us to decode them again in the 19th century.
What a massive journey. I mean,
Yeah.
we started with King Narmer's giant hat and the birth of bureaucracy. We looked at the staggering architectural trial and error of Sneferu and Khufu.
Yeah.
We unpacked the political maneuvering of Hatshepsut and Akhenaten and Ramesses II inventing ancient PR. And we end with the quiet, bureaucratic death of an entire written world.
It's a profound arc. And there is one final, mind-bending thought from the sources that perfectly ties this ancient history to our modern lives. I want you, the listener, to really think about this.
Okay, what is it?
The ancient Egyptians' greatest export might have been the invention of writing itself, which eventually made its way to Greece. But ironically, the famous Greek philosopher Plato actually argued fiercely against the invention of writing.
Wait, really?
Mm.
One of the greatest writers in history was against writing.
He was. In a dialogue called the Phaedrus, Plato argued that if humanity adopted written texts, people would stop exercising their memories. He believed that relying on external symbols would implant forgetfulness in our souls.
That is fascinating.
He said we would have the illusion of infinite wisdom on the page, but internally we would possess no actual knowledge.
That sounds exactly like the debates we are having right now. You look at how we outsource our memories to our smartphones. We don't remember phone numbers or directions anymore.
Exactly.
And now we are outsourcing our actual thinking and writing to artificial intelligence.
Really? It forces you to ask a very uncomfortable question. Look at how easily the Egyptian language vanished when the system broke down. Was Plato right to be afraid of relying on an external system? Have we gained access to the infinite knowledge of the world, but lost our own internal capacity to remember it?
Man, I am going to be thinking about that for a long time. Next time your phone battery dies and you realize you don't know your best friend's phone number, just remember Plato warned us.
He really did.
We highly encourage you to go visit a museum, stand in front of one of those statues, and look at the hieroglyphs with a new perspective. Just remember to be kind to the statues of those ancient scribes. Their knees have been hurting for 5,000 years, and they still haven't finished paying off that dowry. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.